I'm so lucky that I have been made a moderator for such a wonderful session. I would like to welcome you on both on behalf of the festival and on behalf of Yashoda to this campus.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. At first, I would like to begin with, because of the diversity of the audience here, if you could initially just speak about the Ananda Sangha and about the Art of Living course, just to introduce yourselves in regard to how do you mentor a particular program, how do people come to you, and they may have come for various reasons. But during the program, at what point do you feel that an influence of scripture or Veda has actually made them feel different, they react differently, or they begin to understand the course in a very different manner from the others, the group, and then they keep in touch with you, and then they follow up and become stronger. That's it. I'd like to start with Aditya ji.
Thank you, Mr. Bharat. Good morning, everybody. So Ananda Sangha is committed to sharing the teachings of Paramhans Yogananda. You may know him from his well-known book Autobiography of a Yogi. And Ananda was started exactly 51 years ago by one of Yogananda ji's disciples, Swami Kriyananda. So we basically, how do most people come to us? They read the book Autobiography, or they see an ad and they especially recognize Yogananda ji by that picture on the cover of the book. They come seeking his teachings because we offer a how to meditate class usually at the beginning. At what time do we see the involvement of people with the scriptures? I would say actually from the very beginning, we don't call it that way. His teachings are of course very universal. He took from different traditions, including Buddhism also, certain practices, and he kind of, you might say, gave a not so much of a structure but a flow of how classes could be done. So we offer the meditation techniques from the beginning, but what we call our step 2 is where we offer the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, and ultimately before initiation in a technique called Kriya Yoga, which Yogananda ji spoke about. It's a pranayam alluded to in the Bhagavad Gita, also Patanjali Yoga Sutras. Before people take initiation in the Kriya technique, we have them get introduced or familiar with the Bhagavad Gita teachings, again to show how the scriptures can guide us even now. And not going into much detail because they ultimately want to reach Kriya, and studying the scripture, practicing it is a lifelong commitment. But yeah, those are the 2 books we touch upon, apart from some others.
Namaste.
So Art of Living, in a certain sense, has a lot of activities happening. Some people get to know us through our Seva projects. We do river rejuvenation, so many other socially relevant projects. We have education. There are some people who come looking for a sense of spiritual upliftment. There are a lot of people who come from a sense of word of mouth. Someone said that they benefited, and so someone else says, oh, I also would like that. So in that sense, I would say Art of Living is not just a one track kind of thing, but we have many kinds of people from all walks of life. That's why today we're based in about 155 countries across the world, and people from all cultures are able to resonate with these teachings. Whether they come from a sense of yoga, philosophy, from a sense of seva, karma yoga, or any other form, what the Art of Living course really gives us is a firm basis for spiritual progress in a certain sense. All of the knowledge seems to be perfectly good for others. जब गीता कहती है कि कर्म करो फल की चिंता मत करो, तो हमें लगता है औरों के लिए कह रही है. तो it is sadhana, it is our ancient Vedic tradition has always been an amalgamation of technique and knowledge. Knowledge without the technique to make it happen does not stand firm. It's like you need a foundation and you need a building. So in the Art of Living series of workshops, we have workshops for children, we have workshops for grown-ups, adults, We have workshops for people who'd like to volunteer, train their volunteering skills. So in that sense, the the Vedic philosophy gets translated into an action item, so to speak. And that's how this amalgamation of technique and knowledge happens in the art of living. And we have found this very effective because, like you mentioned, people who come looking for something find many other things. And that's how they tend to stick on, stay in the Sangha.
Thank you. Uh, Both your programs, for want of a better word, it would be too presumptuous of me to begin to question those various aspects. But in terms of focus of this particular session, how would you see that a key message of the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, or teachings of Christ, or Patanjali Yoga Sutras, or the Vedas actually become structural components of that particular mentoring matter? You know, how do you essentially bring together the key message, and do they actually are they required to be told that okay, this was so mentioned in the Gita and therefore this is part of the program, this is so mentioned in the Vedas and therefore it is a part of the program and it will help you because it has been such a age old message? That sense, Kashinaji.
So the way I look at it is to make something more universal. It makes sense to see the unity of thought across cultures, across traditions. And in that sense, we never actually say that this is from quoted from here. But what we do say is that knowledge is eternal. Anantai vai Veda. Gravity is eternal. An apple fell on someone and said law of gravity, but it existed before. So in that sense, the eternal truths enshrined in the Vedic traditions is what is present in traditions across the world. And so when that gets translated into the modern day idiom, in the modern context, then it becomes more relevant for people. And that's what we do in the art of living. So in Germany, we might be giving certain examples which are relevant to that place. In Latin America, the whole course is structured in such a way that it resonates with the people there. Yet the principles remain the same. Definitely.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Especially to answer the second question, sometimes people from a different culture want a reference, or the young mind is seeking, is there any relevance of something which was written so many thousands of years ago? So it is helpful to quote. But yeah, you can't go by that because, of course, first of all, nobody likes to know what is written in the Gita unless they have come to the point that they want to know or they are sincere to that degree. I think what people do seek right away, I think this is why they may step into any church, temple, or mosque, is that will this bring me peace and more happiness or calmness and freedom or the ability to overcome my problems? But let's say I'll give a simple example over here. Yogananda ji alluded that the Bhagavad Gita starts where both the armies are opposed to each other. They are standing there and Krishna is telling Arjuna about look at the warriors on that side and we are going to start battle. And in that moment, when Arjuna sees his grandsires and teachers and cousins on the other side, for a moment he says, no, I can't do this. And long story short, he says, I will not fight. And then it says the bow slipped from his hand. He let the bow go. And Yogananda ji said that, you see, that happens to all of us. And he said he must have kept the bow aside. But he said what happens to you and me is you see a host of problems in life. And you say, oh, I can't do this. And he said, you bend your spine. You give up at the beginning of the battle. So he said the first step is keep the spine straight. And he said the chest is the spine, is the bow. Your spine is the string of the bow. And then you begin the battle. Then you do pranayam. Then you focus at the point between the two eyebrows or the heart, which again has symbolism. But you can't go by this symbolism, hence let's do this. In the beginning, you may just tell people, that let's sit up straight and let's take a few deep breaths, or let's just walk in place and generate some energy. Let's do some exercise before we sit down. And people say, hey, I'm feeling good about this. Why did this simple thing not strike me? So the answer is yes. Sometimes you have to quote the scripture and sometimes you don't have to. But the interesting thing is, again, is when you quote the scripture, people join the dots and they say, oh, this was relevant thousands of years ago. People had the same problems. I'm having the same challenge and I'm finding solutions when I follow it.
Bringing both these schools of thought together to crystallize into meditation, how do you look at such a form of practice, which is one of the most difficult actually? For those who say I meditate regularly, one would know that no, it is actually very difficult to do so, and it is so difficult to continue to do so. And therefore, are there any particular passages in the Gita or in the Vedas or in any of the scriptures, including the Yoga Sutras, that actually help you to start again, to refocus again, to begin again, or to be stronger, to accept that failure? Okay, I can't do this meditation as it has been taught to me, but I may be able to, evolve it some more. I can be able to perfect it in a different way, but am I doing it right or not?
Thanks for asking that interesting question. It reminded me of a verse in the final chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, which is called Thou shalt attain me. Krishna is telling the devotee, you will attain me. And he goes on, he's kind of recapping the whole verses. And one verse is one of my favorites. He said, oh Arjuna, if you can't do pranayam, try to do seva. If you can't do seva, express me your devotion. And he said, if you fail in all the above, bring me thy failure and thou shalt attain me. That it is so sweet that, and Yogananda ji, in the beginning of his explanation of the Gita, he said, you see, God is on your side. Krishna is on your side. You're not fighting God or trying to impress him. He understands how difficult it is, but he wants, and who will bring the failure to God or somebody? You have to have a childlike nature to do that to some degree. So I think it's difficult on one level. It's easy if you think that no, banat ban jaye, I'll do this, and someday grace will make it happen because we do only so much. You can do your part. Grace is a huge unseen component.
So I would say the whole of the Bhagavad Gita, the Yoga Sutras are actually a manual for a sadhak. And every obstacle that is found on the path of sadhana is enumerated in the Yoga Sutras. How to overcome those obstacles is also mentioned. In fact, for samadhi, Patanjali says, Samadhi Siddhir Ishvara Pranidhana. So if you really want to get perfection in samadhi, Ishvara Pranidhana or devotion or surrender to the Lord, that is so important. And I find this a very beautiful concept. When I feel that I am doing something that it's my limited identity, it's my limited effort that is in play. And if a thought comes up, then I think, oh, I made that thought happen. But when I see that it's all happening by the grace, it's all happening by my Guru's grace, it's all happening because of the divine, wherever the faith is, then I'm able to let go of that thought that interferes with my meditation. Otherwise, the ego tends to hold on to that thought. And that's why the Patanjali Yoga Sutra says that Samadhi Siddhir Ishvara Pranidhana. Only when you let go of the idea that I am doing something, am I able to experience the depth of meditation. The second thing that I would say is, we tend to label our meditation. We say, oh, if this happens, it's meditation. If this happens, it's not meditation. But the truth is that we have no idea what meditation is. If I throw the garbage out of my house, then I don't sit to analyze, oh, this is yesterday's tomato peel or whatever. I just chuck the garbage out. In meditation, two things can happen. Either there is a complete absence of thought, quiescence, rest, or maybe something that's getting processed. Some thoughts are getting released, some emotions are getting released, and that's perfectly part of meditation. And I think this is what, like Davidji also said, that when we see that the totality is meditation, then we are able to stop judging or labeling ourselves, and that devotion is really what helps us to perfect our meditation in a certain sense. Does that make sense?
But the journey from meditation to sadhana to surrender itself is quite a complex inner journey actually. In the Rudrashtakam, it is mentioned in one of the stanzas. The sadhak says, "Na janami yogam japam." No, I do not know yoga. I do not know japam. I do not know how to meditate. But I will continue and continue and continue. I'll keep on doing it. So, at what point is surrender to be understood? Because he's just surrendering. He's saying, I don't know how to do it, but I am with you. I am going to be with you. So, at what point can the scriptures help us understand? Or do we actually need the scriptures or the Vedas to understand surrender?
So I would say that there is the scriptures gives us many different ways. In fact, the Vedic tradition doesn't say that everyone is of one kind. It recognizes there are some people who are more logical in nature, and that's why the Sankhya Darshan is there. Through logic, attain the divine. There are some people who are more prone to yoga, to do some, to unite, and therefore the Yoga Darshan is there. There is Nyaya, logic, there is Vaisheshika, the material science. Padartha Jnanat Moksha Kanad says, Kanad Rishi. So, in a certain sense, I would say the Vedic tradition is all inclusive. It doesn't say if you're thinking like this, you're not mine. But it says whatever your thought. In fact, there's Charvaka, which says, I don't believe in God. So, that is the beauty of the Indian tradition that has been all inclusive and said, wherever you are, there is something for you to do. And I believe that today the world needs this inclusivity. Today, as Gurudev Shri Shri Ravi Shankar ji says, religion is like the banana peel and spirituality is the banana inside. Today, people are holding on to the peel and forgotten the banana. So, and I feel forums like this are places where we can really look at the magnanimity of the spiritual traditions and see how inclusive it is and how possible it is for each one of us to attain the ultimate. And this is what the Vedic tradition truly tells us. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. And like, for example, the thought is coming, the Gita, there are many verses one after the other, I forget the chapter name, but where the, verse, the offering, one after another, what kind of offering. So Krishna is saying you can do a yagya, you can offer certain food patterns you have, you can offer something you like. At one point, from a yogic perspective, he says there are some who offer the incoming breath into the outgoing and the outgoing into the incoming, thereby making rendering breathing unnecessary, that they enter the breathless state. That breathless state is simply in Hindi called Vishwas Avastha. So when we say Vishwas kijiye kisi cheez pe, as long as your breath is irregular, you are not sure of yourself, you are not sure of other people. But when you're calm, when your breath is very calm or subdued, then the truth presents itself in the form of peace, calmness, joy, intuition for that matter. And you say, this feels right. So I think it's a directional process. It does take a long time before you reach even the scripture. Again, quoting from the Gita, it says that first we are sent good teachers and friends and good books, but ultimately a scripture comes to us. Many times we make the mistake of thinking the scripture to be absolute, or once in a while somebody would declare the scripture is the guru. Yogananda he said it cannot be. He said the guru's word can be chop wood and you'll find God through that. But he said you cannot argue with the book. It won't reply back. But if you ask a guru, you say something, you ask questions in the right spirit, they can set you straight. So I do think that, different grades of self-offering is suggested. Meditation is one of them. And ultimately, each person has to keep asking that next question, and then they're guided. As they say, part of receiving a good answer is to ask the right question, no? So I think that's what, at least in my journey, I've seen that you ask one question, then you get some clarity, then you go further, you say, this makes sense, that makes sense.
Vedas, as you said very truly, Vedas and scriptures are such age-old. They've always been there, and we have always been learning from them. But in terms of the Sikh religion, the Guru Granth Sahib was ultimately made as the full stop. Okay, henceforth there will be no Guru but the Granth Sahib. And therefore the written word is the paramount in that sense. If the written word is so paramount, and in order to look at the impact of Vedas or scriptures in our actual life, for example, just taking up meditation, do you actually need a guru? Or can you just read the book and start off? Or can you watch a YouTube video or listen to Eckhart Tolle in that sense? And at least start, at least begin to cross over the line. And then when do you need hand holding? And how much of it?
I raised my hand for this, sorry, Kashi.
I think we both agree on this.
Yeah. You see, somebody asked Kriyanandaji, my own teacher, this question. This was a journalist, and this was going to come out in a national newspaper, Economic Times. The person says, "Do I need a guru?" And Swami said, "Oh no, you don't need a guru." And some of his disciples for the last 50 years, they were there, they thought, what? All our life he was telling us, you need a guru, you need a guru. And here he says towards the end, in the last year of his life, he's telling this person, you don't need a guru unless you're serious about finding God. So you said it, you can make a start. Start with a YouTube video, read a good book. But you see, ultimately, again I'll quote Yogananda ji, he said, do not mistake the technique for the goal. A pranayam can take you so far, but let's say even Kriya Yoga for that matter, which for us is of paramount importance. It can take you so far, but ultimately the Gita declares that the consciousness of the Guru is what enables Samadhi to come. So we have to put in our self-effort through the technique, through preparing ourselves, through self-discipline and so on, opening the heart. But what fills in your effort is the grace of the Guru, no?
So yeah, I guess there's, for me at least, there is no two ways about it. In fact, if you look at most of the texts, if you look at the Bhagavad Gita, every chapter Krishna says something else. It's probably one of the most confusing texts if you just look at it without any context. In one chapter he says karma is the only way. The next chapter he says forget karma, bhakti is the only way. Next he says all this is forget it. In the end he says forget all dharma, only me. So taken without context, taken without a proper guidance, I would say many texts have the possibility of taking us astray. And I see some places this is where fanaticism has germinated, because there is no one to really give a broader perspective to that. And that's why I feel the consciousness of the Guru Tattva. The second thing that happens is often people mistake a body for a Guru. And this is where the problem comes. So I would say the Guru Tattva, the consciousness, there is the innate nature of guidance that is there in the consciousness. And that is what in the Bhagavatam also, it is said that anything can be your Guru. A bird flying can be your Guru. The whole universe is our Guru. We learn from so much. Guhya, that which is hidden. Ru, Rashmi, that which throws light. So that which throws light on that which is hidden is truly the Guru. And in that sense, each one of us is a Guru to someone. And each one of us has many Gurus. Guru Matra Pita, Guru Bandhu Sakha. So in a certain sense, everyone is a Guru. At the same time, there is definitely someone who has made such a big impact on us, who has brought us so far, and having that connection with someone enables us to walk the path. It's when the doubt comes up, that's when the need of a Guru is felt so prominently. When everything is perfect, then you say, well, what's the need? But when things start shaking, that's when the Guru plays the biggest role in our life. Even to learn a bicycle, we sat on the bicycle when it started shaking. All we wanted was someone to hold the bicycle. So we felt the need for a Guru right from those times. We can call it by many words. And today we are very lucky that there are so many great saints, and this path of spirituality has come up again. The very fact that a gathering like this is here and so many people are interested in listening to something on this for so many days is, I feel, a great sign for the world. Yada yada hi dharmasya glanir bhavati bharata abhyuthanam adharmasya tadatmanam srajamyaham. The aham, the consciousness keeps coming back again and again. And I feel the time is ripe for the world. There's a huge transformation already happening. So many people, so many youngsters are now finding this ruchi in the path, the interest in this path. And I feel that's why for all that is happening in the world, there's a lot of hope, there's a lot of positivity.
Very true. But in terms of Partha learning from Vasudeva, he had no option. He could not get away. No.
That's what a guru does actually.
He made the time stop there. He made all other action to come to a standstill. So he made it easier for his student to sit there and to listen to him. But today we have WhatsApp, Facebook, and every other deviation that can take us away, diversion. So even if somebody is sitting in front of a guru, he's probably thinking, how can I post this immediately? How many likes am I going to get? So attention span is absolutely crashed out. There is no attention span. When I started teaching here at the academy, we were told that an adult learner can focus on a teaching for 90 minutes. It has been coming down, and today they say it is 2 minutes, but that 2 minutes is made of different parts. So 10 seconds is WhatsApp, 10 seconds is Facebook, and all that.
Are you all paying attention?
So if surrender is at the very end of the Gita, and if you needed to go through so many chapters to finally crystallize and understand that surrender is all that matters, how do you express that today when such knowledge is so paramount? How do you express that today and make somebody else understand, accept, and practice and mentor it through his diverting through the various diversions in his mind?
There was a time when, to be accepted by a guru, one had to do a lot of things. It was very difficult. You had to go to the forest, renounce everything. But now it's not the art of leaving, it's the art of living. And that's why I feel that when I'm told that to get to the final it'll take you many, many years, then people give up right at the start. But if you're told that, hey, it's a program that's just for 3 days, come, you learn something and start the journey, bite-sized pieces is what people are looking for. And I feel that this is the language, the idiom of the times that allows us to reach out. If I keep saying that what used to happen 10 years back, I should keep doing now, then it doesn't work. Our textbooks change, and I say I want the latest version. I never read the newspaper of 10 years back. I say, I don't eat food that was kept in the fridge 1 week back. I say, I want fresh food, more sattvic. In a certain sense, the knowledge is not dead knowledge. It's alive. It's transforming. It's moving with the times. And that's why when we have a guru, then we are able to see what's relevant for right now. What's the language that we're talking? So today, we might start with yoga. We might start with addressing stress. We might start with health. There are so many places where the journey can start. So Krishna also never told Arjuna to surrender to start with. He was a good friend. He said, if he had told him to surrender, he would have said, wait, you're just my charioteer. But it took the whole process for him. And in the same way, I think, though the final goal is something that's obvious, it needs a path. And that path is something that various gurus have charted out, and it seems to be working today.
In the Gita, again in the last chapter, after Krishna has alluded to all those verses, he finally, with all respect for Arjuna, the disciple, he says, now do as you feel. I have narrated all of this to you. Also, Kriyananda ji used to remind us this simple example. He said, you could be living right next door to the best restaurant in the world, but you won't go in unless you're hungry. And again, you see that people come from all over the world seeking teachings of one master or another because they have that hunger. And that hunger one cannot give. Different people have different kinds of hunger. And finally, you have to see, like Kashiji was saying, that is it a workshop, is it yoga, is it meditation, is it arts for that matter, music, or just recovering your health, healing, that the question is what will work? And if the person says, oh, this worked for me, then they may ask the deeper question. Again, because spirituality is not a weekend sport, you might say. Once you start understanding what it is, it's a commitment of many incarnations, actually, the scriptures declare. But yes, the way we get introduced to it in different lifetimes is different. And I think people are asking for certain things, and if they're getting that, then they might take the next step.
There is a parable in Zen Buddhism where a teacher is working with 5-6 students, of whom one of those students refuses to learn, and the others begin to learn very nicely. But the teacher keeps focusing on that particular student who refuses to learn and keeps repeating that lesson. And the other students get impatient. They say, we have learned this, so for us, can you separate us and take us to the next course? But you keep on making us sit with this fellow who refuses to learn. And therefore, the teacher says, when he refuses to learn, he is my teacher. Because he is teaching me how to teach. And therefore, when you mention that 3-day course or a short introduction course, there will be many dropouts. And those of them might not return again. So how does one go back to the scriptures or the Vedas to look at parables about actual life, outside the meditation class, in their house, in their life, in their living with their loved ones? How do those behavioral aspects come into a teaching paradigm?
I would say unless the knowledge is integrated into life, it does not sustain. I learned so many subjects in school. I studied in 1600 something, whatever, some war happened, and after the exam I promptly forgot about it. For some of us, we forgot before the exam, that's a different thing. But a lot of information that goes in, if it's not relevant to our life, it does not stay. And that's why the key thing about any knowledge is to make it relevant to life. In fact, there is a similar story from the Shankaracharya tradition. Adi Shankara had 4 prominent disciples, and one of them, Trotakacharya, was the person who held back, so to speak. And yet, Adi Shankara waited for him. The other students said, well, let's go ahead, what's the point? And it is said, the Guru felt so much compassion that when Trotakacharya came, he was reciting the content of that class in the Trotaka meter. That's how he got his name, Trotakacharya. And so for me, I see that if anything depends on my ability, then it's limited. But when my progress depends not just on my ability, but on the ability of the teacher, and that's where I can make great strides in my understanding. That being said, all the scriptures, all of the ways of the spiritual thought have always talked about transcending our own abilities. Every ability of ours reinforces the identity. And when we hold on to an identity, then it stays limiting. But for us to reach the goal, somewhere through smaller techniques, through various ways, one has to transcend. And it is possible. Now you might ask, well, then can I continue staying in society or do I need to get out of society? This is where the way Krishna tells Arjuna that fight, which is just an allegory for saying do not run away from life but engage with life. And that's why it's the Vedantic tradition which really allows us to engage in life as a tool for spirituality. I'd like to just complete with one more story. Shivaji Maharaj was a great king, and we all know about him here. He had a guru, Samarth Ramdas, and when he went to his guru one day and said, well, I'd like to be in the ashram. It's much nicer here. I know the feeling. So the guru said, okay, tomorrow come, I'll give you your seva. This is a story. And so it says that next day when the king came there, Samarth Ramdas said, go sit on the throne and rule the kingdom. And he said, but that's what I want to give up. I'm done with that. He said, yeah, the kingdom is mine, you are mine, you sit and do my job. And it is said that that's when Shivaji really found success. The story goes like that. And this story illustrates something so beautifully that we don't need to stop doing whatever we're doing. But when that same activity becomes a spiritual activity, everything that we're doing can take us towards the goal. And for me, this is how we can continue to live in the world, do our job, do everything, and be spiritual.
I'll add a rider to that. In your course of meeting up with so many seekers, have some of them taught you to approach them differently?
Oh, yes.
And how, can you give us some example?
Well, people get so many things out of the same technique or teaching, you might say. Just yesterday I was sharing with another batch that people come and we ask them, why are you here? And somebody said, oh, one of my friends took these classes and he's our superior manager in the office. So I've seen him for years. But off late, because he sits in a glass chamber, I was intrigued because he keeps smiling nowadays. So he said, I went up to him and I even asked him, are you reading a joke or what's going on? And he said, oh no. He said, no, I'm just seeing you smiling so much more. He said, am I? He said, oh, I've started meditating. Or another person told me he had this field work, and they were given a koita, we call it, basically a knife, to slash the brush. And he said, because I knew earlier I have to go from here, he said, I would always hold it in my hand and just keep cutting as I went. But he said, now I barely pull it out because I can just move the things with my hands and I have become more aware of what I'm doing, what do I need to do. So simple things like that. Of course, people's irritability goes down. You might say, as a doctor, I can share people's blood pressure improves, they sleep better, their immunity gets better, so many different things. So each time you share, yes, you learn different things after their feedback. Also, how you approach somebody. In the end, somebody may say, I just didn't understand anything. So you have to change your way of sharing.
If we just keep meditation, if we keep the Gita and the scriptures aside, and if we look at the meditation per se, can it become prescriptive? Can we actually say, okay, your blood pressure will go down, you will begin to sleep nicely? And these are actually very personal matters. Those who would come would have been disturbed at some particular level, and they might say, okay, this I relate to. I am experiencing these problems. Let the Gita be as it is, let the scriptures be as it is, but if I can sleep better tonight, why not?
Yeah, definitely. The Sudarshan Kriya that we teach is now accepted by NIMHANS, the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, as a prescriptive tool to combat depression without any drugs. So we are actually using this as a tool. It's been validated scientifically, and NIMHANS is prescribing it as a method to really combat depression. So it's just one single an instance, but I would say anecdotal evidence suggests that is very effective in many different cases, and so a lot of research is definitely going on. Today, meditation and blood pressure, diabetes, there's such good correlation that's there. There are lots of papers, and that's why I would feel I see a lot of doctors also prescribing meditation and as a prescriptive tool. At the same time, I would say just limiting meditation to health benefits is like trying to take an elephant gun to shoot a fly. Or, you know, so in a certain sense, there is so much more. But even if that one gateway can open up something beautiful, I think it's worth it. And that's why we continue to do a lot of research. In fact, we have a research institute in the ashram which conducts both theoretical research and empirical research to validate all these techniques and tools that our Vedic traditions have given us.
I had a talk yesterday morning over here on health, and I started the talk by reading from the January edition of National Geographic called The Future of Medicine, and The Economist from last week, which was covering backache. And in a nutshell, there were huge articles on yoga, on the microbiome, which is the gut-brain axis, how it affects our health. The Economist was quoting 85 to 95% cases of backache, which are not mechanical in origin. Even from 2017, the American Health Association has been prescribing the first line of treatment is not a painkiller. It is yoga, tai chi, acupuncture, and such, psychotherapy. So the point is that trend has come already. Enough research has happened, and it's now a matter of people practicing it for something like 6 weeks, at least 3 to 6 weeks, 12 weeks, and one by one. Even if you give, there was a research in 2009, 12 minutes of meditation for 12 weeks, twice a day, for 12 weeks, increases the thickness of the brain, even in those who were 70 years old, and the outer covering of the brain, the cortex, and that brought back age-related dementia, memory loss which had happened. Things started improving for those people. So I think there's no question about that.
That's very true, but unfortunately, like, there was a paradigm or a perspective over some years that if you focus on too much of linking it to clinical aspects in India or doing research into that, you would be labeled as a fundamentalist or somebody who is stretching out an ancient science into current perspectives, purposefully. But there are many journals in Russia and others in China across who have done a lot of research into this. But I would like to look at one particular aspect, since you mentioned NIMHANS, that is the National Institute of Mental Health and Neural Sciences at Bangalore. Here at Lonavala, at Kaivalya Dham, also there is a lot of research going on separating the various asanas and linking them to diabetes and understanding various other perspectives, blood pressure and all that. But in all these paradigms, what they have found is that your principal enemy is your family and your loved ones when you start, because they are going to laugh at you or because they are going to joke about it and all that. So is it good that one should start with your close family together, or is it okay to just start alone and to bear that laughter and to be bold enough to, and encounter them and go across?
The laughter is very good for your ego. I mean, if people are whoever is interested should start, no? If you have some sibling who is happy, start with them. I would encourage, start with somebody who's enthusiastic. Otherwise, yes, many a times people can pull you down, laugh at you so much that you lose your interest and you start doubting the credibility. Well, give it a few weeks with somebody who's enthusiastic.
Yeah, I would say whether you have a company or don't have a company, definitely start. When I was in college, I did my master's at IIT Powai, and I felt so interested, I went to the ashram. And now you know how it is. IIT graduate, सब कुछ छोड़ के आश्रम चला गया, बाप रे. दूसरों के घर में हो तो लगता है अरे कितना पुण्य आत्मा है. पर अपने घर में हो तो फिर मुश्किल हो जाता है. So initially I did face a lot of challenge, but over a period of time, I had such wonderful parents that they realized that I was doing something wonderful. They also came, and today my mother stays with me in the ashram in Bangalore, and she loves the whole idea of daily satsang and everything. In fact, the scriptures say, Satsangatve nissangatvam, nissangatve nirmohatvam, nirmohatve nischalatatvam, nischalatatve jivan mukti. So that's the pathway that's been given. So for any practice, it's always good to have company. And when we have good company, then it makes the whole path easier. So, definitely.
Just to conclude, but with a very personal questions, since you mentioned IIT and personally, I mean, most of the people here would not know personally about what would have been the turning point in your life. You know, you are in IIT, so what was that exact point or a stretch of it when you decided, okay, I'm going to move away or move with it or be stronger because of this?
Absolutely.
You know, actually, I would say the third would apply.
So, when I was in college, I was doing theatre, I was a GSEC of my hostel. Um, I did a lot of things. In a certain sense, I think I was searching. And I was searching for fulfillment in various things. And having done all of that, I saw that there's something more to life still. And that's when I had the good fortune of meeting Gurudev Sri Sri Ravi Shankar. And that was for me my turning point. I learned the Sudarshan Kriya, and suddenly a whole new avenue opened up for me. And I realized that the whole field of consciousness was vast, and there's so much to achieve here. And somewhere, the day I met my Guru, I realized that this was the path that I was really searching for in all the hundreds of things that I was doing. And ever since then, it's been nearly 25 years that I've been with the Art of Living. And it's been an amazing journey. I had gone to one of my alumni meetings. And you know, all alumni meetings are about comparing pay packets and कौन कितने पानी में. तो सब लोग बात कर रहे थे और अचानक ऐसे लगा, suddenly I looked and saw that I had traveled to more countries, I had met more people, and when people saw me, they smiled. And I realized that even though I had not, in the normal quote unquote parameters of life, I had not got a big bank balance or anything. But in the bank balance of life, I think there's something so wonderful of being on this spiritual path that when I look back at my life, I would not exchange it for anything else in the world.
So beautifully speaking of the joy and contentment that comes.
But Anandaji, you are a medical doctor, isn't it?
Yeah,
So why are you somewhere else?
Why am I on this path? Well, for me, the journey began about 13, 14 years.
I think it's because he's a doctor, because we are intelligent, that's why we're here.
You know, I marvel at modern research. I follow it up every week, sometimes if I have the time on a daily basis, and sometimes I tell people, because this is how I was thinking, I'm 38 now. 38 years, some months ago, I was a single invisible cell in my mother's womb. I just find it very fascinating what's going on. You know, how multiplication happens, how our body is so intelligent, so many beautiful things. Like St. Augustine said, people go all over the world, they go see the mountains and seas and they marvel at things and they pass by themselves without so much as stopping to wonder. So I think medically, yes, I was again in that thing. I was like, oh, maybe I should become a neurologist. I come from a family of doctors. So I sat with some, good doctors, but then I was like, well, it all stops at death. And then I started questioning, because in emergency I saw people dying right there in front of me. So my question was, what just happened? Or you might say, before death, so much suffering is avoidable by the person's own involvement. It changed their lifestyle, stop drinking, don't overspeed. I mean, simple things can stop disasters. But then I had heard about yoga and meditation. I found the autobiography of a yogi and I started reading. And Yoganandaji's exposition on death, he said it's just like a resting phase. You come back. It's like going to another room. It's like going to sleep. You wake up in the morning in another body, another life. I said, because people die after hearing about the death of some others. They commit suicide, they go into lifelong depression. And I said, you see, even illness is not such a bad thing that we doctors or people make it out to be. There are lessons to learn in illnesses. First lesson is, I need to take control of my mental state, my emotional state, my obesity, or whatever it is, heart situation. Then you say, oh, even if all of this, because there are people who do very good yoga and meditation all their life, but then cancer catches up. Spiritually, we say it's karma. So, to have the heart to accept that, okay, even if death comes, it's not the end of matters, I'll pick it up again. In the Gita, it says you pick it up in a good family if you have good karma. They encourage your spiritual growth and so on. So for me, it had somehow, you might say, life guided me to the point where suffering and death prompted me to, be open. My good fortune was I was open to the yoga teachings. I didn't just say, no, this is rubbish or this is not possible. So, and then of course I can't say it's been my total experience, but I do feel that there is truth to what the Vedas, the scriptures, and the saints who keep refreshing these teachings, what they are saying. So I'm quite happy that health should be 50-50. Doctor will do some part, but you do half the part at least.
Very true. On that wonderful point, can we throw open the questions? Mics, please. They have more mics.
Thank you. I think it has been very enlightening, and I would like to take a little a page out of whatever was being said about how we experiment with spiritualism nowadays. There's a lot of awareness about spiritualism. Everybody likes to say, I'm not like you, I'm spiritual. So, and they do it through YouTubes and all that, and every moment they're failing. When you see it around you, they're not good with their driver, they're not good with the waiter, they're not good with, another speeding car going by, but they are spiritual. So, how many, like 1 billion, if we become spiritual suddenly, where will we go as a country, I wonder? I mean, it'll be heaven, right, over here? I don't know. But right now we are on earth, and I'm still on the spiritual path, I'm nowhere close. I just had a question as a teacher. Does the student find us, or do we find the student? Who will beckon us? Will it be Art of Living, because I've done that? Will it be Ananda Yoga, which I'm following? And so many other things, like we have Sadhguru, we have, our own scriptures also. But I'm a confused person. Who will find me, That I think you should try and answer. I guess that must be in our consciousness somewhere, all of us.
The Vedic tradition, they say there are 2 types of people on the path. One is the Marjara, the cat. In the case of the cat, it's the mother that holds on to the child and takes it around wherever. The child just relaxes. Other is the Markata, the monkey. In the case of the monkey, it's the young one that holds on to the mother. The mother just walks around wherever, goes around or jumps around wherever. So both types of devotees exist, and it's up to us to see which category we fall in. The beauty of the Vedic tradition is I would compare it like to an ice cream shop. There are all the flavors kept there, and you choose which one that really interests you, and then you continue on that path. So, it's up to us to see Marjara or Markata.
There is a art of living. It is said that similar to that.
Yeah, I'd like to just add a line. The scriptures also declare, quite like Kashiji said, when the disciple is ready, the Guru appears. And it's a personal soul-to-soul recognition, feeling, There can be many gurus, teachers you might say, or gurus, but the scriptures also unanimously say there is only one Sadguru who is God appointed. It is their God appointed duty to introduce you to God. So keep looking, keep asking the right questions, take your next step forward, and when that moment comes, you will feel it. Just like we have felt, we feel the rightness of every step we take. Even if you make a mistake, you learn from that mistake and go further.
Yeah, excuse me. There is an art of living. Similar to that, it is said that there is an art of dying also. Can you throw some light over it, please?
Well, I would say opposite values are complementary. It's only when there's living that dying can exist. There are lots of spiritual traditions. And it's not my job to compare and say this is better, this is. All I can say is from my authentic experience, this is the path that I have walked on. And I find joy in this. And there are other paths that are there that are. So just like there is some sound coming from somewhere and suddenly all our attention goes there. In the same way, as we are walking on a path, there can be many diversions. Yet, when we are able to hold on, stay on, then the mind gets in. So, Gurudev says very beautifully, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar ji says, respect everyone but follow one. And that's the way you can really reach the goal.
Sir, there was a saint in the first century, Saint Paul. Earlier he was called Saul, then he became Paul a couple of days after Christ's passing. And he used to tell his disciples, he said, verily, verily, which is to say, truly, truly, I say unto thee, I die daily. And the meaning of that, how can somebody die daily? The thing is, yogically, if you can leave your breath, if you can stop your heart, if you can go into that state of samadhi, nirvikalp, first sabikalp, then nirvikalp samadhi as yoga sutras declare, then that is the art of dying. And one becomes a jivan mukta, one can become, a completely liberated being also. And that is why you might say on one level life has been given to us. On one level we are dying every moment with an inhalation and exhalation. When we are born we inhale. The last thing we all will do as we leave the body consciously or otherwise is exhale. But if we can do that consciously, if we can learn how to die through deep meditation, through sadhana, through grace, often all of those combined, then I think, it will be a successful journey. Then we are born to eternal life, you can say, as Christ said.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I don't have any question about Vedic literature or something. I am a fully follower of that. I fully believe in that. But I am sometimes very curious to know about when we see around the society, like people refer of Vedic literature in astrology, in Vastu Shastra, and there are a lot of commercial exploitations going on this basis. So can you throw light on this? I'm not talking about authentic people. I know there are authentic people also, but majority of the people who are on the advertisements on YouTube, and we see the exploitation going around in the society. Both can answer on this.
Sorry, what was your last line?
You both can answer on this question.
Okay. Well, in our line of gurus, one of our gurus was once at a Kumbh Mela. I think it was 1800 something, late 1800s, and he was seeing different people, and he thought, oh, so and so is not a true master and such. And then suddenly he saw one of his neighbors who was dressed as a sadhu, and he was begging for money. And his mind said, oh, this is just a commotion of charlatans. And suddenly his guru appeared, and he said, son, don't judge all, for the few that you see, or the many that you see. There are still some men of self-realization. And his next words were very touching to my heart. He said, "Though many wander here still in delusion, there are some men of self-realization." The point is, why is somebody acting that way? Because they don't know anything better. So have compassion, kindness, perhaps in some past life, many times even in this life, we have acted that way in some form or another. But our job, your God-given job, is to improve your lot, improve yourself. And I think that's the best we can do anyways, no?
I would say that we need not single out the spiritual path. Every profession has both good and bad. There are good doctors, there are not so good doctors. There are good engineers and not so good engineers. So this is something, the opposites continue to exist in life. It's how we handle the opposite that helps us on the spiritual path. In the Ashtavakra Gita, Ashtavakra says that being wrong against a wrong is also wrong. And a lot of times, this is what happens to us. When the sense of righteousness holds on and I say, you are wrong, 3 fingers point back to me. In the Yoga Sutra, it says, those who are doing apunya, for them upeksha. When we engage with the negativity in the world, it tends to bring us down. And that's why the Yoga Sutra is brilliant. It says, upeksha, don't engage, don't get involved with it. That's when you have the power to change the situation. It's only when we get caught up in some negativity that we keep complaining about it, and every complaint robs us of the ability to do something about it. And so that's why I would see every negativity in the world as an opportunity to do seva, as an opportunity to transform something. And when I look at it that way, there's nothing in this world that's not a tool for me to be on the spiritual path. I think now time is of the essence.
On that point, I'd like to conclude in a very selfish note that I have been blessed that we had such a wonderful panel discussion. I am certain that with the lesser number of questions, I am sure that there was much more acceptance of those perspectives. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.